Welcome to Asia-Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia-Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. The unreliability of the United States as a military ally continues to be demonstrated. Just a couple of days ago, we were able to see President Donald Trump's extraordinary interview with Laura Ingraham on Fox News, repeating over and over again that Canada should be the US 51st state. I found that shocking, deeply offensive, disturbing, all of those things, as do most Canadians. Now, Canada has been backed publicly by politicians from Germany, France, the UK, probably many others, but from Australia, as far as I'm aware, zero. I think it's also worth noting that the Trump administration has started interfering directly in the politics of other countries, coming out in favour of the Conservatives in the forthcoming Canadian election earlier in February, after his outrageous, insulting performance at the Munich Security Conference, during which Vice President J.V. Vance lectured the Europeans about not having to worry about Russia or China, but instead the enemy from within. He then met with leaders of the extreme right-wing Alternative für Deutschland party, the AfD, in a clear attempt to boost their chances in the then looming German election. To put it politely, the AfD are from the very far right, and up until a couple of days ago were big fans of Russian President Vladimir Putin. But thanks almost entirely to the behaviour of MAGA Republicans, the political sands in Germany are shifting, and I'll have a bit more about that in a moment. At least Australia is safe for the moment, presumably because we don't have a political party extreme enough for Trump to back, though that will change if neo-Nazis start standing candidates in the next federal election in the hope of attracting funding from Elon Musk. Now, I mentioned Canada. There was an interesting story during the week that Canada plans to buy the Australian JORN radar system, broken by the ABC's Andrew Green. I'll say for listeners, he's managed to overcome his childhood trauma with a cat, and he is undoubtedly Australia's finest defence journalist working in the electronic media. He richly deserves a pay rise and promotion, but with the ABC being mismanaged by a cabal of Maoist tree huggers, that's not going to happen in the foreseeable future. Now, Canada buying JORN is a very interesting development. It was announced by the Canadians, and our government then, strangely, was playing catch-up rather than being involved in the news from the beginning. I don't quite know what that's about. I have my own theories. Anyway, the Canadians value the deal at about $6 billion, which would be a huge defence export if it were a direct sale to prime contractor BAE Systems Australia. But from what I understand about this, it sounds like it's a long-term development activity rather than the immediate sale of a physical system. I might be wrong. It's something that I'll research further. Now, I'm a little bit surprised because while JORN is an amazing system, I worked on the original telecom bid for it, so it's one of the rare topics where I actually know a bit about the whole thing. Anyway, since it uses high-frequency radio signals, it depends on the stability of the ionosphere. You get huge range by refracting HF signals off the ionosphere. Now, if we look at the physics of the Canadian system, apparently the intention is to be able to look into Russia, but when you look at a map of the world, this would mean that the signals kind of have to go over the North Pole. And I can assure people that the stability of the ionosphere that way north cannot be guaranteed. In fact, on the contrary. So I don't quite know how it's going to work. The Australian system looks north over the equator. The ionosphere, particularly at night, is very stable. Anyway, that's for the defence scientists to work out. It sounds like good news for Australia and might be an early indication of Canada once again seeking to break from the United States in terms of defence technology. I previously mentioned that they are going to have a look at their F-35 purchase and see if they can cancel some of that. Now, I also wanted to mention some comments made by Singapore's Defence Minister Ng, who I've had the pleasure of interviewing a couple of times, because while Australian politicians remain so utterly complacent about the US security relationship, Europe is in an uproar, but in our region, so is Singapore, I've mentioned before, so are Japan and South Korea. Anyway, quite recently, Dr. Ng said, and this is a direct quote, "It'll take me a couple of minutes to get through the whole thing, but please bear with me because I think it's worthwhile." He says, "The US is the moving spirit behind most of the post-World War II constructs, together with its alliances, particularly for globalization based on inclusive free trade. We signed a free trade agreement with the US some years ago, but now I am sure you have your own characterizations of what American foreign policy is, but in my mind, it is that America's primacy has become the overriding consideration. Not that it never was, but I think that it has now become the pole star of foreign policy, even at the expense of bilateral ties or multilaterals. It is a great disruption, so we have to recognize that. How countries and regions respond to this significant shift in US foreign policy bears watching. The US image has changed from liberator to great disruptor to a landlord seeking rent." I'll repeat that last part of it. The US has become a landlord seeking rent. In another speech, a couple of days later, answering the question, "What is in store?" he said, "But the answer to that question is going to occupy us for at least a decade. It is going to decide the fate of Singapore and Singaporeans for this generation. All the headlines that you read, it is not business as usual. It is ground-shaking and earth-shattering. It is a political earthquake with a tsunami coming. We do not know when the tsunami will occur. We know that it registers on a political Richter scale. In all these examples, there is one point. You know something is coming, but you do not know how to predict it accurately, when, and in what shape and form. But whatever comes, we must face our future resolutely." So that's Singapore's Defence Minister. He's a hugely impressive man. He's been Defence Minister since 2011. He was a former surgeon, a very poor upbringing, and really a sort of rags to riches story. Now, he is alerting to the people of Singapore, and I hope the broader community, that what is happening is unprecedented, it's scary, and we have to start preparing now for huge changes in the shape of the world order. But what sort of language do we hear from our political leaders? Well, we don't hear anything at all, because they are disgracefully complacent about the radical change in the security environment, pretending to themselves and the Australian people that nothing of significance has occurred, and we should just have another beer and get ready for the new season of MasterChef. Now, this is like Australia in the 1930s, when most politicians assured Australia, when the security environment started to deteriorate in the second half of the decade, that everything was fine because Mother England would always come to our assistance. Well, remind me, how did that work out? And just a quick reminder that Singapore has just increased its defence budget by 12.5% for the current financial year, and so it's around the 3% of GDP mark. And Singapore, by the way, because of the conscript system, could actually field a military of about 2 million people out of a total population of 6 million. Very powerful force, in some respects, superior to Australia's. I can come back to that on another occasion. Now, another event completely ignored in Australia, as far as I can tell, is that Germany is now suddenly and dramatically moving towards full rearmament with a massive increase in defence expenditure underway. Legislation has passed in Germany. I won't go through all of the detail, but it basically means up to €1 trillion will be available for a combination of infrastructure work, some of which is defence related, for example, on transport, and the rest for military equipment. Germany is the world's third largest economy. It's very dynamic, and this is a huge change. Europe currently buys about 2/3 of its military equipment from the US, and the plan now of European countries is to reduce that to 1/3 as quickly as possible, which is why so many countries are lifting expenditure, and with as much of that money going to their own industries, and they have also included Ukraine industry as part of the mix. And this is why the share prices of companies such as Germany's Rheinmetall and Saab of Sweden, the share price is going through the roof. So Europe is mobilizing. In our region, so is Japan, so is South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, because they are all extremely alarmed. Here, there is nothing. And the level of disruption will only get worse, because US tariffs look set to further increase after April the 2nd. They appear to be locked in concrete, so there will be even more disruption to the rules-based order that the current government says it's a big supporter of. And again, I'll just repeat the belief in Canada that the United States is hitting them with tariffs. It's a deliberate attempt to destabilize their economy so they will be begging to become the 51st state of the US. I just think that's appalling. Now, Ukraine, the situation there, nothing particularly good. We are days away from another round of negotiations, if they can be called that, in Saudi Arabia, on the one hand between the US and Russia, and then separately between the US and Ukraine. The readout that we are all getting is that the US is simply repeating the talking points of Russia. We are meant to have been in a 30-day ceasefire on infrastructure targets. Now, within 10 minutes of that being announced, it resulted in a huge barrage of Russian missiles and drones targeting, any guesses, common class? What did the Russian missiles target? If you said Ukrainian infrastructure, you would be correct. In the last month, we have had a number of important geopolitical events, most importantly this one of the US showing that it can no longer be relied upon. But we have also had the 3 Chinese warships circumnavigating Australia and carrying out live-fire drills in the Tasman Sea. Now, we are only a very short time away from the federal budget, just hours away, depending on when this podcast goes out. So it's a chance for the federal government to demonstrate clearly that it is doing something, not by postponing an increase in defence expenditure until the 27-28 financial year, but doing something now, and preferably doing something dramatic. Because as many of us have been saying, and I'll be doing some future reporting on this, the industry group, the Australian Industry Group, now has some hard numbers. They have analysed the local defence industry spend. It confirms we are going backwards. More of that in the future. If there is more money, it should be devoted to Australian-made drones, and lots of them. That's the fastest way of getting local Australian capability. As I keep pointing out, Ukraine has a drone command. Small kamikaze drones are now more important to a soldier than a rifle. And they are talking about them taking over from both conventional and rocket artillery. Another gap that we desperately need to plug is a sovereign communications satellite system, because without that we are totally effed. And I have spoken before about Defence abruptly cancelling JP 9102, the military SATCOM project, saying apparently that they were looking at different technologies. There may be a little bit of truth to that, but for the moment there's nothing to replace it. Now, I have more than a sneaking suspicion that our US friends have said to Richard Marles and senior defence people, don't you worry your pretty little heads about needing your own sovereign satellite capability. Just keep on piggybacking on our systems. You will be fine. Well, the whole reason why Australia was going down the path of getting a sovereign satellite capability was that we discovered that the US was not particularly reliable, that Australia was either being charged a lot for access or we couldn't get it when we wanted. So that is a key enabler. I've sort of mentioned the news before. South Korea wants to work with us, developing a sovereign low Earth orbit constellation. Let's work with them as a matter of priority. In the last podcast, I had another thing to say about AUKUS Pillar 1, quoting HR 3939, and I'll just remind people of that because this issue is only going to increase in intensity. When I said that it says Australia will only get up to two nuclear-powered submarines, so that's either 0, 1 or 2, I've had some pushback from people saying, oh no, Kim, that can't be right. Everyone's saying between 3 and 5. Well, I'll just read it out. The title, A Bill, in capitals, to provide for the transfer of not more than 2 Virginia-class submarines from the inventory of the Navy to the Government of Australia on a sale basis. It's there in black and white. I've also commented that an increasingly irritated Prime Minister doesn't like any questions at all about AUKUS. He just instantly snaps. I might say, on the other hand, he totally arcs up about a baby wombat being taken from its mother by a US influencer, as he should, but he needs to be seriously agitated about national security as well. And as for Defence Minister Richard Marles, as I've commented before, he does like his empty slogans, such as impactful projection and shared equities, and now a new one is creeping into the mix for AUKUS Pillar 1, namely that it's a treaty-level agreement. Except there's no such thing. Either you have a treaty or you have an agreement. So clearly we don't have a treaty. If one existed, we would have seen it, or at least heard it described, if not in this country, then certainly from the US and probably from the UK. So let's be clear, the public have been duped into thinking that we have an agreement with the US, but if it's not legally binding, what is it worth? I'm not even sure how much of this is written down. I think it's probably just verbal assurances and emails between Australian officials and US officials of the kind of trust me variety. Okay, that's all I've got time for in this episode. In the current week, I will be covering the Avalon Air Show. I'm hoping there's going to be some interesting news out of that. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia-Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.